All right, it is week number 4, chapter number 4 on our study through the book of Jonah called Annoying Grace. And I like to call this chapter the forgotten one because it kind of has a disheartening ending as we take a look at how Jonah responds to how God showed up in amazing ways to the people of Nineveh. Jonah's response is different than maybe we would hope for. And honestly, I think it's an honest look into even our own hearts. So if you haven't, pause this, take a look, read Jonah chapter 4, because right now the discussion is going to begin. All right, so we've made it to chapter 4, final chapter of this short little book of the book of Jonah. And I would describe chapter 4 as the forgotten chapter. I think everyone remembers chapter 1, where we know Jonah's calling to Nineveh. We know the part where he flees in chapter 1, right? We definitely know chapter 2, where he's in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And we definitely know he was spit out and eventually goes to Nineveh. I think most people know that. Chapter 4, Brandon.
Yeah.
Forgotten chapter, because what we see is Jonah's not painted into a good picture. We were joking a little bit about who actually might have written this book, and most believe Jonah wrote it, and it's not a flattering ending to the story arc of Jonah.
No, not at all. Like, he comes out of Nineveh, and he has basically been like an incredibly successful preacher. Yeah. Like, he has gone in, he's converted the city, like the cows are repenting.
Yeah.
Like, this is fantastic. Like, this is all you could dream of. And he walks out of the city and he's mad at God about it. And you finally get to the reason why, like why he ran in the first place. And it's not until 4:2 that we find that out. He says, "Didn't I say before I left home that you would do this? That you would change your mind, that you would relent and not hurt Nineveh?" And you finally understand, he didn't go not because he was scared or because, he didn't want to walk the 800 miles to Nineveh or whatever. He didn't go because he knew God would be gracious to Nineveh. And so God then kind of asked him, is it right for you to be angry about this? And we can it's absolutely not. But Jonah still thinks he's justified in his anger. He's justified in being mad about all this. So he goes up outside the city on kind of a hillside, and he sits down to wait and see what happens. Presumably, he's waiting to see, God's going to change his mind and just strike them all down. So as he is waiting, God, in his graciousness again to Jonah, provides a vine that grows up over Jonah's head and shields him from the sun and takes care of him. And Jonah's, for the first time in the book, Jonah's happy. This is great. I got shade. This is wonderful. But then just as soon as that vine is grown, God sends a worm that destroys the vine and makes it die. And you can imagine, at this point, Jonah he's off the rails now. Yeah. He's just so mad that the vine is gone. And, basically comes down to the point where it's like, just kill me. God, just kill me. You frustrated me enough.
Jonah gets so mad that he wants to die at the end.
Yes. Yeah. He just wants to die over this. And so then God asks him again, is it right for you to be angry? And Jonah still comes back. His answer, yes, I'm angry enough to die. And it's at this moment that you finally get what God is trying to do with Jonah and the vine. He's trying to make Jonah understand, you care so much about this plant. And there are 120,000 people down in Nineveh who don't know their left hand from their right, is what the text says, who they're just in spiritual darkness. They don't know anything. Yeah. And you're so concerned about this plant, and yet you don't see how I should be concerned about the fates of 120,000 people. Jonah, what's wrong with you?
It's interesting. It reminds me of a time I remember very distinctly at school when I saw a kid misbehave very aggressively and got sent to the principal's office, and the principal went to my church. And I was like, it was like that moment where you get in trouble and you're in upper elementary, we're like, ooh, oh. And we were all like, what's going to happen to this kid? And I remember talking to the principal because he went to my church. And I said, what happened to him? And he said, nothing. Nothing happened to him. We talked through the problem. And I was mad. Mm-hmm. I was sitting there, self-righteous, good kid that I am, and I was mad that he didn't get in any trouble for what he did. Yeah. I was just so angry about that situation. And it's interesting that God gave me that moment in life because I'm 38 now and I still remember that principle's grace to this kid that deserved far worse. And he dove into the story. Derek, what do you think as you see the way Jonah responds to the grace of God to the people of Nineveh that he doesn't like, but he sits there in his anger? Where does it take your heart?
Yeah, again, it's us. I mean, it's 100% us. You know, Brent, you're talking about him being, justified in his anger. Well, tongue in cheek, like each and every one of us are justified in our anger about legitimately everything in our life. Yeah. With the people we're angry at, with the people that we're frustrated with, we all think that we know everything about what's always going on, everyone's intentions, and it's just not true. Like, it's just not true. And so like when I see that, it just makes me laugh because I can see in my own life, even because I think that, like, for whatever reason, for me in my head, like, you look at God's grace in your life and you think that, like, okay, well, like, you did something stupid or someone, did something stupid. Now you're affected. Then God's going to bring grace in the situation and bring you out of it and redeem that. And then you're going to move on. And it's like this like linear path. Yeah. And it's not. Like, I crack myself up because even right now for us as a family going through a really difficult season, I find myself doing the same type of thing where it's like one day I'll be like, okay, like, full of faith. I want to keep pressing forward. It's fine. Next day I'm angry with God. Yep. Yeah. Wake up the next day and I'm good. Yeah. You wake up the next day and it's like, man, now I'm frustrated with this. Yeah. And then I'm frustrated with that.
That is the truth.
And it's like, there's never this like linear, like, it's because it's almost like we see so many stories and movies and it's like, oh, hey, everything works out great in the end. And that's not Jonah, because Jonah's real life.
Yeah, he walks out of there. He's mad at God about the people in the city, and then he's happy about the vine, and then he's mad about the vine, mad at the worm, and then he's just going, "I'd rather be dead." Yeah. And it's just this like kind of like keeps reacting. I think one of the quotes I love about what you're saying is we want to judge everyone around us by their actions, but we want to have ourselves judged by our intentions, like because we know we have bad actions, but inside my heart are good intentions. Right. But I'm going to judge you by your bad actions. 100%. And it's interesting how we do that.
Yeah, it's funny because the verse that I thought of immediately was actually taking it back to everything is backwards. And so in Matthew 5, this is a verse that I really struggle with. It's Matthew 5:45. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So the Lord shows mercy to those that we think don't deserve it. And that is a hard thing, because this is what I see in Jonah, and I see it in us too. Like, we just think that because we avoid sin, that God owes us something. Yeah, that we're like, oh, we're better because, and I used to think this too. Like, I like to say, like, I'm a recovering legalist because that's how I used to view my life, and as a transaction, right? And not as a real relationship. And so,
I have less debt than they have, God. So you've forgiven less, but the reality is that's not true. Yeah.
And that's what Jonah's seeing here. He's like, these people don't deserve your mercy. And that's a tough thing because we don't get to decide that, because God is God. We are not. And I really have struggled with that because it's hard for me personally, because of that like transactional brain that I have, to see somebody else getting like grace that I think I deserve. Yeah. And that is kind of the whole point of this story here, is like the Lord can send rain and send the sun on whoever he wants to.
How many times have you said, God, haven't I done enough to deserve better treatment than this situation? I mean, we've all prayed that prayer.
Well, I mean, I'll pick up right here real quick. I think it's applicable for us at the table, if whoever's doing the study. Like, you think of the person in this world that, like, in your honest heart, that you would look at and say, I do not like that person. I borderline hate that person. Yeah. Well, that person's sin cost just as much as ours did. Yeah. And it's like, okay. That's like, and if you don't believe that, then you've missed the point of the gospel.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, one of the things that I'll keep saying to, and we can spend a little bit of time here, is just how Jonah points us to Jesus really well. It's very prophetic in that way that it points us to it. But one of the lines I love using, and you can use this in a lot of different other places in the Bible, but one way you can use it here is to say Jesus is a better Jonah. Jesus did what Jonah couldn't do. And I was thinking about that. One of the things you were reaching into the Gospels there. One of the things Jesus said is to love your enemy and pray for those that persecute you. And we see that modeled perfectly in Jesus, right? Up until that moment, Jesus, felt that. And but yet modeled loving your enemy. And as another thing we see is that Jesus was called to be this moment of crucifixion. He knew what lied ahead. He had read the scriptures and knew it pointed to him as the Messiah, that he must suffer. He had surely known Isaiah 53 and what it said and what lied ahead. And in the garden, what we see is Jesus pleading with God to not follow through with the thing he was called to do that he doesn't want to do in that moment, and says, God, if there's plan B, I'm ready to hear it. Like, I'm ready for the word to come. But what we see in Jesus is he goes anyway.
Yeah. It's amazing, really, when you think about it, that God uses this prophet's act of disobedience to point towards the ultimate act of obedience.
Yeah.
And to say, like, hey, because Jesus will later pick up on, no sign will be given to this generation but the sign of Jonah, who was in the fish for 3 days, and the Son of Man will be in the grave for 3 days. And it's just so interesting that this detour that Jonah took, God's able to grab hold of that and say, no, this is pointing towards that better Jonah, who's going to once and for all show us what grace is.
And we see the grace that God's not doing this inside. This doesn't take place inside his people.
Right.
This takes place outside of that. This is taking in a foreign place, in a place that would not know him, but they will know the story of when Jonah showed up in Nineveh.
Yes.
One of the interesting things, Brandon, you were sharing with us is how this fits in with the nation of Israel, how it fits in with the Jewish faith in when it's read. And I think there's some interesting connections with that.
Yeah. So one of the things I had never heard until we were getting ready for this study is that Jonah is read every year as part of the liturgy of the Jewish people. And they read it at a very interesting time. They read it on the day of Yom Kippur, which is the day of atonement, which is the day when you recognize your sin and that you need atoning for that. And the reason why they read Jonah as part of that is because it serves as a reminder that everyone needs grace. That the people of Nineveh, they needed God's grace. The prophet who's sitting on the hillside stewing over the mercy of God, he needs God's grace. That there's no person that you meet, and that includes looking at yourself in the mirror, right? There's no person you meet that doesn't need the grace of God. And so I think it's just interesting that of all the books, the book where the character struggles with grace the most is the book they read on that day of atonement and say, yeah, we're like, all of us need the grace of God or else we're not going to make it.
It's interesting because when you look at the story arc, I said this in week 1, watch what happens with Jonah and watch what happens with the people of Nineveh. And it ends with the people of Nineveh in this moment, at this moment in time, responding with what they know, which is a very small understanding of God, but yet they responded with what little they had. They responded. And you look at the story arc of Jonah, and I'm not sure he's in a better place. No. And God's trying to use this moment to shake him loose. And it reminds me of times I remember again in my small town church growing up, I had a youth pastor that said to the church, I hope I have the kids in this building that kind of like that you're having to patch walls, because he got in trouble for that. They used to get mad that skateboarders were at our church in the parking lot after youth group. And he goes, I'm sorry, but I kind of hope they break some of this stuff because my heart is for them. Right. And what's funny about that is there's a guy on staff that you guys know, my good friends that I get to work with, was one of those skateboard boys. And like, that's the truth of it is when we look at today's applications, and that's where I want to spend this kind of final moment. What are the ways that all of us respond and say, but not them, but they're not welcome in here? And what are the ways that we do that personally in our own hearts where we allow ourselves to kind of live like Jonah and be frustrated with that?
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, like, it's really interesting that in chapter 4, Jonah gets mad at God for being compassionate and gracious when he just praised him for it in chapter 2. Like, he throws his words back at him. He's like, you said you are a gracious and compassionate God. So I think if we're serving a gracious and compassionate God, we can't get mad at him when he does that.
He was happy with him receiving the grace.
Right, exactly.
But not it going to others.
Right. Okay. So I think when the Lord does that compassionate and gracious, like, again, like, we don't get to choose that when he does that. So we can't get mad at him for being who he is to other people. Yeah. And I think that's what I'm trying to remember is like, okay, like, I've experienced his compassion and his grace like tenfold in my life. So who am I to say like he can't do that for other people too?
So that's a good word. Yeah. We want it on our own schedule. Derek, what about you?
Yeah. I think I speak from my own perspective on this, and I, speaking for other people, there are way too many ways that even in my head, I section off who these people are, who those people are, who I am in the terms of all that. and then you take it super personal where it's like, hey, who are the individual people in your life that like, when you're really honest because of the pain that they've caused in your life, that you're annoyed whenever good things happen to them? Like, who are those people? Because I think we each can empathize with that of like, okay, like I thought, like, because I think each of us think that we know enough, we have enough wisdom, whether saying it out loud or not, of like, hey, I know how that person's life should end up because of the decisions they make. And it's like, you don't know what God's doing in their life. Like, you don't. And at the end of the day, again, God's going to use whomever he pleases to do his will and to accomplish his purposes. And I think for us, that's a very humbling thing. It's uncomfortable for us because we feel like we want to be important enough to be used. And it's like, hey, like those people, especially when Jesus talks about loving our enemies, like we should want to be those people that step into the uncomfortableness of even the individuals that have hurt us.
Yeah.
And there's boundaries in that. And I'm not saying that there's not, but when you look at the world, the way everything is narrated, you have these people, you have that country versus this country, you have that country versus that country. We have way too many walls. Way too many walls. You see it on church staffs. You see it in church communities. And that's just one part.
Yeah.
And then you take a step outside of that world, and it's even worse.
Sure. Give us the last word, Brandon.
I think the book of Jonah is left open-ended for us on purpose, right? And I think we're supposed to walk away from it with exactly what you're talking about in our minds. Like, who are those people to me? Who are the Ninevites to me? Because the last question, like, it just hangs out there, right? Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city? And you can kind of, well, yeah, God should. And so maybe I should, and maybe those people that I would withhold grace from, they're the very people who need it. And grace goes completely against the way we're taught this world works. We're taught from very young age, it's cause and effect.
Yeah.
And grace just breaks into that, and it challenges us. And it makes us, it forces us to look at ourselves, to look at the people around us and think, if God could be gracious to me, then what's stopping him from being gracious to anyone else? What's stopping me from being gracious to anyone else?